Trump's plane was just coming into Washington from Florida, nearly 2 in the morning US time, when he posted an abusive tweet mocking our supposedly brilliant NATO ally, the United Kingdom, for the decision to give away the island of Diego Garcia for no reason whatsoever. An act of total weakness, an act of great stupidity. He said it was proof Europeans couldn't be trusted with the security of Greenland, and was quickly on the tail of 2 earlier posts, with mocked-up pictures of European leaders being lectured by him about an expanded US, and this image of him planting the US flag on Greenland. In Davos at the World Economic Forum, where Donald Trump arrives tomorrow, fellow NATO leaders were lining up to reject Donald Trump's politics.
We do prefer respect to bullies, we do prefer science to plotism, and we do prefer rule of law to brutality.
We stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future.
Earlier, the Democrat governor of California urged Europe's leaders to get up off the floor in their dealings with President Trump.
I can't take this complicity. People rolling over. I should have brought a bunch of knee pads for all the world leaders. I mean, handing out crowns and this is pathetic. This guy's playing folks for fools, and it's embarrassing.
Europeans think this is diplomacy, and this will ultimately
this is
work.
Diplomacy with Donald Trump? He's a T-Rex. You mate with him or he devours you.
It's a message some seem to have heeded. The Belgian Prime Minister, host to NATO headquarters, is one of many leaders here who has a meeting planned with President Trump tomorrow.
At the moment, we're dependent on the United States, so we chose to be lenient. But now so many red lines are being crossed that you have the choice between your self-respect. Being a happy vassal is one thing, being a miserable slave is something else. The message that we have to send, you're crossing red lines here. We either stand together or we will stand divided. And if we are divided, there is the end of an era of 80 years of Atlantism is really drawing to a close. And, as Gramsci said, if the old is dying and the new is not yet born, you live in a time of monsters. Yeah. And it's up to him to decide if he wants to be a monster, yes or no.
In Davos, the Chancellor eyeballed Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary and said America needed allies and wasn't self-sufficient.
Now, you do have some reserves of critical minerals, but not everything you need. 90% of your critical minerals at the moment come from the US, from China. You need to wean yourself off those. Sure. Yeah, but you won't be able to do that without the help of Canada and Australia and other countries. And so, for all of your strengths, we do also need to think how we can preserve some of the things that the US has benefited from in the NATO alliance and the Western alliance.
Experts acknowledge Donald Trump's outbursts mean discussions have begun in secret in Whitehall, pondering life without the US military and intelligence relationship.
Yes, of course, they're having to have these conversations. When they do, they find it's very difficult.
The options are grim. The spending involved is huge.
So yes, they've got to spend money. Can you disentangle yourself much harder? In the UK, you're talking about decades. The relationship on the nuclear, on the maritime, on the intelligence is just too close.
Responding to Donald Trump's attack on the Chagos Islands deal, Downing Street insisted Donald Trump had backed it last year and may have been venting frustration over Greenland. The deal was done to put control over the US Diego Garcia base on a secure legal footing and keep China in particular out. By coincidence, today the government gave China the green light to build the giant embassy it wants in London. The government rejected protests about security risks and said intelligence agencies had not objected to the new building. As Davos braces itself for the man leaders here today dubbed an imperialist and a monster, some wondered if the Ukraine peace efforts could be an early casualty of the Greenland crisis. Is one of the consequences of the last 72 hours or so that any security guarantees that the United States were to give to Ukraine look a bit meaningless because the US's word is not its bond?
Exactly, and this is the real challenge for Europeans. And, if you again look at it from the Russian perspective...
But they're central to that peace plan.
They're absolutely central.
Some people never thought it was a very high hope, but any hopes of a Ukraine-Russia peace deal are dead?
Potentially, and I think the most immediate consequence is it's out of the news cycle already. It's exactly what Putin wants, because to a certain degree he can sort of almost hold his hand up now and say, well, we're not delaying, this is you because you deprioritised that.
Denmark issued more footage from its deployment of extra troops to Greenland, added to last night. Donald Trump has still not ruled out engaging with them militarily. Allies for now, in a war of words. With those acerbic attacks on Keir Starmer, British foreign policy over the Chagos Islands from Donald Trump came out of a bit of a clear blue sky to the government here. That Chagos deal, the government had actually sat on for a while, waiting to make sure that they had squared Washington, and they had fairly good reason to think they had. Donald Trump stood next to Keir Starmer and said he backed it. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of the State, said very enthusiastically pretty similar sentiments. So they're wondering, why has this happened now? Is it perhaps that it's got an inconvenient logic to it, in that America would be using a base there which, under the British deal, would actually be under the sovereignty of Mauritius, and that doesn't quite match what they're demanding in Greenland? Or is it simply that they're lashing out? Whatever it is, it's added to the headaches for Keir Starmer. He has any number, of course, on the domestic front. Only yesterday he was relaunching his soft diplomacy approach. Don't bicker in public, try and change people behind the scenes. That's now got its biggest test. He's got a China trip to navigate on the back of that Chinese embassy decision. He will now be going to China in a different time zone, trying to deal with whatever pops up next in this. And as you were hearing there in that report, potentially coming down the track, in addition to all his other troubles, potentially eye-popping defence spending if this spiral downwards continues.
Gary, thanks very much. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara, in Davos. But first, let's go to our US editor, Anushka Astana, at the White House, where President Trump is currently speaking to the media. Anushka.
So, look, Donald Trump has been speaking for over 20 minutes in a press briefing, and so far he has not mentioned the word Greenland. He's been focused entirely on the domestic story here, on his battle with US states attacking really quite awfully Somalis in Minnesota, and he has not talked about foreign policy, but none of that is going to calm down Europeans. There are literally hundreds of European diplomats who are based here in Washington, D.C. And over the past year, they have been doing this diplomatic dance to try to work with this administration, with this White House. Many of them, including the Brits, have bent over backwards. They have sucked up to him. But I tell you what, when all of this came out about Greenland, their heads were absolutely spinning as they tried to understand what was happening. And one interesting thing that I've heard from those who have spoken to officials in the White House is they are convinced that while Donald Trump has posted a picture of him that you saw with Marco Rubio, with J.D. Vance, planting that flag in Greenland, they do not think that either the Vice President J.D. Vance or the Secretary of State Marco Rubio knew that these tariff threats were coming. In fact, they think that they had their minds elsewhere. J.D. Vance on the immigration story, but also on affordability, and you can see that on his social media. And the Secretary of State Marco Rubio on what is happening in Latin America. And again, look at what he's been posting. He's talking about Venezuela, about meetings with counterparts in Honduras and Panama, about Cuba. This is not a priority for them right now. And so the diplomats are trying to work out how exactly they handle this right now and what it might all mean. And it is quite interesting to speak to the British diplomats in particular, because they have a view that I think differs perhaps to the French, which is that people shouldn't rile Donald Trump, that the more you raise yourself, the more that he raises in response. And they are a bit frustrated with what we've been seeing from Emmanuel Macron.
Thanks, Anushka. Well, let's go now to Paul McNamara, who's in Davos. Paul.
Yeah, whether it's geopolitics or general finance, there is a mood here in Davos that what unfolds over the next couple of days here could echo through the next few years or even decades to come. There was a feeling a few years back that Davos was on the slide. Now it feels like this could be the most consequential meeting of the World Economic Forum in recent memory, there are a record number of CEOs and chairmen and business chairmen that are here. There are heads of state from more than 60 countries. There's a record number of G7 leaders, and they're all here for one reason: Donald Trump and his vast entourage, which are arriving early tomorrow. Everything about this is extraordinary. The fact that the main topic of conversation is Greenland, not Ukraine. The fact that in the run-up to this, Deutsche Bank started musing about whether or not EU nations could, quote, consider the, quote, weaponization of capital. Speculation that EU nations could start selling off their trillions of dollars worth of US debt and stocks, which in turn would drive up borrowing in the US as retaliation. Now, there has been a bit of a dip in US stocks and the value of the dollar during the day. That's not considered down to this. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has poo-pooed that idea. But the mere fact that one of the largest investment houses in the world is even opining on that gives you a little indication of to the state of the world that we're in. Now, talk to people involved in geopolitics or financial folk here today. There is a differ among them. Some are more, one of them, the finance side, is more optimistic. The geopolitical side, absolutely not. They're saying, don't judge President Trump on what he says. Look at what he says and say, absolutely, he could carry on with this. But the one thing that both of them want is strong leadership from every leader that has to face up against him over the next couple of days. Descending into Davos, the decision makers, big business, global leaders, and those that travel in their circles for their annual gathering.
And you asked about
But one nation looms large over this global gathering. This church is hosting the US mission to Davos for the week. The message left outside by the owners, not the tenants. It's not just wisdom, though, but patience UK business leaders are calling for.
We're in the position where we expect to see the UK economy growing between 1 and 1.5% this year.
How likely does that 1 to 1.5% growth look like with a 10% tariff, possibly a 25% tariff from the USA?
Well, I think at the moment it's still very much in the threat zone, and I think what's really important
is that what it feels like? It doesn't feel like this is a snowball that's coming down the hill towards us.
Well, look, it's certainly a tough moment for geopolitics, and I think it's a moment for leaders across Europe to stand up for free and fair trade, to stand up for the international rule of law. But business leaders won't react to the tariffs until they see them in place, and hopefully we won't see them.
There is fierce competition for focus in Davos, though. Not just economics versus geopolitics, but which geopolitical crisis most takes President Trump's fancy. How far down the shopping list has Ukraine fallen?
It should be right at the top of the shopping list and remain at the top of the shopping list. And all the brouhaha over Greenland, the impact on NATO, is forgetting the reality that Europe still faces an existential war on its eastern flank.
But does it actually feel like President Trump agrees with that assessment?
No, I don't think he does. I think right now he's focused on putting the stars and stripes all over Greenland, and the impact of that on NATO is frankly incalculable. If Trump launches a military operation or decides to take over Greenland in some other way, that's the end of NATO.
And if you're Vladimir Putin, sitting in Moscow watching all this unfold?
I'm sitting back, chuckling, and popping open bottles of champagne.
The US Treasury Secretary said this afternoon, of course Europe is an ally. Scott Bessent saying NATO membership is unquestioned. That's an assertion that could be tested to its limit over the next 2 days.
Well, one person not in Davos is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He says he doesn't plan to go there after overnight Russian airstrikes left more than 1 million households in Kyiv without power and heating. President Zelensky said Moscow's latest attack was a wake-up call to world leaders in Davos. Well, the former NATO chief and Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen says the US president is now the biggest threat to world peace. Speaking to me earlier, he said Donald Trump was talking like an autocrat and Europe must stand up to him over Greenland as the future of NATO and the world order as we know it are at stake.
President Trump wants to acquire Greenland, but Greenland is not for sale, and you can't purchase something that's not for sale. So his only means of acquiring Greenland would be to conquer it by a military action, which of course would mean the end of NATO. So instead, I think we should table concrete proposals to chew on as an alternative to this discussion on territory.
You talked about having a serious discussion, but hasn't it gone beyond that now? I mean, Denmark has sent 100 troops into Greenland. Doesn't it need to be much more forceful?
Yes, indeed. I think time for flattering has ended. So far, Europeans have done their utmost to please Trump, and we had a very successful NATO summit in The Hague last year. Trump left that summit happy about NATO. He praised NATO and the member states. So far, so good. But he continues his aggressive behavior. So I think time has come to stand up against Trump. I would appreciate a stronger presence of NATO troops in Greenland, and I think the European Union should respond determinedly if Trump carries out the special tariffs on 8 European countries, as he have indicated.
You've said the time for flattery is over. Your successor as NATO Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, sent the most sycophantic, I guess, message to Donald Trump, praising his accomplishments in Syria, in Gaza, in Ukraine. Is that diplomacy 101, or is it sycophancy?
Well, as I said, so far I think it has served us well. But I think enough is enough. The only thing Trump respects is force, strength, and unity. And that's exactly what Europe should show now.
Is NATO dead? Because Trump has threatened a NATO ally.
So far, nothing has happened, actually. But no doubt that if he really attacks Greenland, it will be the end of NATO. And my conclusion is, in that case, we would have to consider the establishment of what I would call a European NATO, a coalition of the willing, capable and willing to do what is necessary to defend Europe.
Do you agree with the Conservative peer Dan Hannan, who said today he has plainly now lost his mind?
It doesn't make sense. And the fact is the American people doesn't understand and doesn't support this aggressive behavior.
You say it doesn't make sense, it's senseless. Has he taken leave of his senses?
I don't know, but my observation is there is no strategy behind President Trump's behavior.
I wonder why you're reluctant to answer that question, because you've said, you know, it's time for flattery is over. So speak plainly. Do you think the people who say he's gone mad are right?
Yeah, but well, I think it is senseless the way he's behaving.
You described Donald Trump as behaving like an autocrat, like Putin, for example. And of course, he's invited Putin to his peace board. He's invited also autocrats from Belarus and Kazakhstan. Is he, Donald Trump, the biggest threat now to world peace?
Yes, indeed. Because we know that President Putin is an enemy of freedom and democracy. We know that Xi Jinping is an enemy of freedom and democracy. But President Trump's unpredictability is actually now shaking the whole world and eroding the transatlantic relationship between America and all the democracies in Europe. So this shaking up the world order creates a lot of risks.
Anders Fogh Rasmussen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, with the UK already in the US president's line of fire for its Chagos deal, the government approving China's plans for a mega embassy in London is unlikely to improve relations. Earlier, I spoke to Security Minister Dan Jarvis about all this and began by asking when the UK government would properly stand up to Donald Trump.
The UK government, led by our Prime Minister, works very closely with President Trump and his administration. We have a very productive operational relationship with the US, our closest partner and ally, and that delivers huge national security as well as economic benefit for our country.
You see, you're still tiptoeing around, aren't you? And, you know, the former NATO chief told us today that the time for flattery has ended. The Belgian Prime Minister in Davos saying, choose self-respect over being a miserable slave to the US, in his words. Show us now that the UK hasn't chosen slavery or supplication to America.
Well, as the security minister with responsibility for national security, I deal with my counterparts in the US every single day. And that relationship that we have with them is in a very good state. It delivers real, meaningful operational benefit, both for us and for them. There are very deep roots to the relationship that we have with the US. And there may occasionally be points of difference, but we will work through those in the way that we always have.
So are the EU leaders who are really, finding a backbone, are they wrong?
Well, other leaders will choose their own approach. I think our Prime Minister has got it absolutely right. He's cultivated a very good, close diplomatic relationship with President Trump. That's why we've been able to secure the lowest tariff rates. That's why we were the first country to secure a trade deal. That's really delivering for people here.
It hasn't done you much good now, has it, with these extra tariffs being slapped on?
Well, I'm not sure that's what people would say in the West Midlands if you go to JLR and talk about the economic benefit that's been accrued to Jaguar Land Rover. But also, what about the operational benefit in terms of our national security relationship? We work very closely with our allies and partners. There will be points of difference, of course, but in the main, I think most people will understand that the Prime Minister's got this right. He's established that close working relationship, and we need to continue to work carefully with our allies in order to secure our national security.
You're choosing your words so carefully, as the Prime Minister has done. And I just wonder where it's got you, because you look at Donald Trump lashing out over Chagos, the UK's deal to hand the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. He said that was an act of great stupidity. Will you go ahead and ratify that deal?
Yes, we will. And I don't think there's anything wrong, if you don't mind me saying, with choosing words carefully. We've got to choose our words carefully because we have to do the long, hard yards of diplomacy and work with our allies, even if there are points of difference.
But Trump doesn't get a veto over that deal. You will go ahead and ratify it?
Absolutely. And there was strong support from the American administration for the deal, as there has been from other Five Eyes and international partners, and of course from Mauritius as well.
One of the things you've described as differences with the US is obviously the approval of the new embassy, China's embassy in the UK. MI5 says potential risks can't be eliminated. Is it worth the risk?
Well, firstly, I don't accept that there are differences with our allies. We work very closely with our Five Eyes partners. And what MI5 and GCHQ have also said is that there are security advantages from this new proposal.
Yeah, but the US is very concerned about it. Leading US politicians have spoken out about it.
No doubt, but I'm very happy to provide the reassurances that I've provided to Parliament, not least in terms of the deal is underpinned by consolidation of the existing diplomatic estate. So currently, China have 7 diplomatic sites in London. Under this new proposal, they will have a single site. There are clear national security advantages from that.
So no matter what the risks of a Trump presidency, he's described as a threat to the world by the former NATO chief, the US is still going to be a closer partner, a closer trading partner for the foreseeable future than China is.
Yes. I mean, as the National Security Minister, our national security is underpinned by the intelligence sharing arrangements we have with our US and Five Eyes partners.
Dan Jarvis, thanks very much.